Okay, our next speaker is Kevin Honk, who is a PhD candidate in the history of art at Yale University, where he focuses on the history of photography. His dissertation, Intimate Exposures, Critical Histories of the Polaroid Corporation, mobilizes artists' Polaroid experiments to surface the corporation's historical entanglements with environmental pollution, the military-industrial complex, and racial capitalism. More broadly, Kevin is interested in the materiality and circulation of photographic objects, with particular regard for alternative photographic techniques, representations of Asian diasporas, and imperial and capitalist networks. And do check out his recent Panorama research note from last fall's issue. Research for this paper, Looking In, Looking Out, Charles Widener's Chinatown Photographs and the Submersion of U.S. Empire, was supported by the Peter Palmquist Memorial Fund for Historical Photographic Research. Please join me in welcoming Kevin Honk.
Thank you, Emily, for convening our panel, and thanks to Todd and Hua for bringing us all together. It's been such a nice couple days, and I've learned a lot from all of the speakers, and thanks to everyone for coming. So, I'll just dive right in. Looking In, Looking Out, Charles Widener's Chinatown Photographs and the Submersion of U.S. Empire. In the latter half of the 19th century, San Francisco's majority white population conceived of the city's Chinatown as a strange colony, to use art historian Anthony Lee's term. Exoticized and fetishized by tourists, San Francisco's Chinatown was the object of a spectacular gaze. Writing in the journal Cameracraft in 1900, the photographer Arnold Genta described Chinatown as hunting grounds for photography practitioners who sought to capture scenes picturesque and novel. While photographers like Genta rendered Chinatown's residents as picturesque subjects for the camera, others rendered the neighborhood as a dark criminal underground. Photographers accompanied police officers on raids of opium dens in an attempt to capture sensational images of a seedy Chinatown. These violent acts of surveillance accompanied debates by politicians and laypeople alike over the possibility of relocating San Francisco's Chinese immigrant population. Maps were drawn that sought to contain the spread of Chinatown, labeling the neighborhood according to its various vices. These local struggles mirrored a national discourse over the issue of Chinese immigration, resulting in the infamous Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which has been discussed by several speakers so far, which severely restricted Chinese immigration to the United States. In this period, as Tifu has written, quote, "With the West tamed, arguably the last frontier was not the wilderness beyond the city, but rather its perceived internal wildness, Chinatown." Although images by Genta and Tabor appear to depict Chinatown as an isolated enclave, an internal wildness within an otherwise civilized city, at the turn of the century, it was clear that California was far from the last frontier. In fact, as shown in this map drawn in 1903, the United States was actively expanding into the Caribbean and the Pacific. At the turn of the century, the US had cemented its status as an imperial power, having annexed Hawaii and won the Spanish-American War, which allowed it to wrest Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines from the waning Spanish Empire. In this talk, I ask how representations of the strange colony at the heart of San Francisco might relate to an imperial imaginary that extended beyond the bounds of the city. Scholarship on representations of Chinatown have shed important light on perceptions of Chinese immigrants in an era of racist and draconian immigration policies. Here, however, I argue that depictions of the city's interior should also be understood as links to an outward-facing imperial vision. Attending to the photographs and movements of one San Francisco photographer, Charles Widener, I demonstrate how vernacular images from this period, reading vernacular images from this period against the grain, allows us to surface a submerged imperial infrastructure, one that connects the racial politics of Chinatown to the US's colonial possessions. This linkage disrupts what Maggie Chow calls, quote, an ongoing pattern of denial that has relegated US imperialism to the periphery of the broader study of American culture. Relating Widener's photographs of Chinatown to his pictures of the Pacific Telegraph Cable, which linked the continental US to its colonial possessions, I connect his tourist and photojournalistic images to an archipelagic network through which US empire was developed and maintained. My interest in this topic was sparked by a seemingly innocent object, a photographic collage of San Francisco scenes printed on silk using the cyanotype method. And the cyanotype is a photographic process that gives the resulting images their vivid Prussian blue hue. As I detailed in a recently published research note in Panorama, which I'm happy to talk about later, several of the photographs on this cloth were taken around 1902 and can be attributed to the photographer Charles Widener, a German emigre who ran a commercial photography studio in San Francisco and earned a reputation as a publisher of souvenir postcards for a tourist market. Though it's impossible to definitively identify the object's maker, the photograph was most likely created by Widener as a souvenir for domestic decoration. There was a burgeoning market for cyanotyped fabrics like this one in the late 19th century, and here's just a couple of examples of how they would be used in the home. There's a lot of pillowcases in random archives. Weaving multiple images onto a single plane, the photo cloth creates a dichotomy between white bourgeois leisure seekers and Chinese subjects. The object contains scenes around the western portions of San Francisco, as well as two photographs in San Francisco's Chinatown. At center is an image originally taken by Widener of Ocean Beach and Cliff House, a Victorian chateau built by the silver baron Adolphe Sutro. In the picture, Cliff House looms in the background while tourists sit or promenade along Ocean Beach. And you can see that Widener also produced this as postcards, and they circulated very widely. The other images from the photo cloth include views of the Pacific, some seals, and two pictures of people in Chinatown. And one thing that is interesting to note here is that the photograph reproduced in the cloth has a slightly different composition to the postcards that Widener also circulated, so suggesting that Widener took multiple photographs of different arrangements of this scene. By juxtaposing photographs of Pacific seascapes with pseudo-ethnographic pictures of Chinatown, the photo cloth contrasts two modes of tourism. Cliff House, Ocean Beach, and the nearby Sutro Baths were popular Sunday destinations for San Franciscans associated with hygiene and fresh air. Meanwhile, Chinatown was a popular slumming destination for white adventure seekers and was frequently described as a source of pollution and disease. While in the oceanside images, the white beachgoer moves freely, in the photographs of Chinatown, however, the camera renders the Chinese figures mute and still. They are not considered part of the leisure class, but rather are rendered as ornamental objects for the bourgeois viewer's enjoyment, here placed literally in the margins of the cloth. Widener's photographs of Chinatown were used to cast the Chinese as ornament and as menace. While he printed his pictures as tourist souvenirs and marketed them to a white Western audience, his images were also used to illustrate racist arguments for Chinese exclusion. In 1902, his photographs illustrated an essay by James Phelan, mayor of San Francisco, arguing for the extension of the Chinese Exclusion Act. Stoking fears that Chinese migrants would supplant white working-class labor, Phelan's essay used Widener's pictures to represent the Chinese as a population to be carefully scrutinized, controlled, and ultimately rejected. Thus, the photo cloth creates a stark contrast between white beachgoer and Chinese immigrant, inscribing a visual logic that normalizes racial and class hierarchies. Yet I became curious about another visual dynamic, which I would describe as a bidirectional gaze. The collage looks inward to Chinatown at the heart of San Francisco, but also outward toward the Pacific. Considering this juxtaposition, I wondered if this object might be understood not only in the context of San Francisco's tourist economy, but also as an object that crystallizes an imperial visual logic at the turn of the 20th century, one that seeks to domesticate the racialized subject and that simultaneously seeks to expand America's western frontier. Charles Widener's own movements provide the answer to this question. In December 1902, around the same time this object was made, Widener was commissioned by the Commercial Cable Company to photograph the laying of the first Pacific telegraph cable connecting San Francisco to Honolulu. The cable would eventually connect the US to the Midway Islands, Guam, the Philippines, and China. In fact, the telegraph cable was laid at Ocean Beach, the very site that was portrayed as a tourist destination in Widener's postcards. Note how the composition of the image by Widener replicates the composition of the Cliff House photograph that Widener marketed to tourists. In the rest of this talk, I will focus on Widener's photojournalistic work, showing how his documentation of the Pacific Telegraph cable sheds new light on his souvenir photographs. Widener's views of bourgeois tourism and picturesque Chinatown belie a concurrent vision of San Francisco as a node within an imperial network. At the same time that his stereotypical pictures were circulating via postcard and entering the home as domestic decoration, reinforcing an Orientalist gaze, he was photographing the expansion of the US's communications infrastructure, a medium that bolstered the empire's military and commercial interests, and that would soon be submerged underwater out of public view. While Widener's photographs of Chinese migrants functioned as visual touchstones for debates that sought to control Chinese immigration into the continental US, his documentation of the Pacific Telegraph cable intimately linked them to the country's colonial expansion. If we consider Widener's photographs of Ocean Beach here, we see on the left a view of middle-class leisure, and on the right, something quite different, a spectacle of technological connectivity and naval supremacy. Here, Ocean Beach is a liminal zone, at once the boundary of the continental US and a critical node within a growing empire. Widener's Chinatown pictures, for which he was much better known, coincided with his trip from San Francisco to Honolulu in December 1902 to document the laying of the cable. Many of his pictures were subsequently published in a special issue of The Wasp in 1903, a popular weekly magazine based in San Francisco. The issue, titled A Pictorial History of the Trans-Pacific Cable and the Commerce of the Pacific Coast, lauded the cable laying as an epic-making task that surpassed the laying of the transatlantic cable in distance and difficulty, and cited the Spanish-American War as the decisive event that made the enterprise possible. Indeed, in February 1899, President William McKinley delivered a message to Congress stating that upon the annexation of the Philippines, Hawaii, and Guam, quote, the necessity for speedy cable communication between the United States and all these Pacific islands has become imperative. The importance of laying a trans-Pacific cable was both military and economic. For McKinley, the Pacific Islands were key military and commercial strategic positions. Connecting them via telegraph would solidify US control over its archipelagic territories and further open, as the WASP special issue asserted, the great markets of Philippines and China. Widener had begun to document the US's military involvement in the Pacific as early as 1899, when the Spanish-American War ended and a conflict between Philippine independence fighters and the US over control of the islands began. In August of that year, a Widener photograph graced the cover of The Wave, a newspaper published in San Francisco and Seattle. Depicting the return of the Pennsylvania Volunteers from Manila, the image shows troops marching triumphantly down Market Street to great fanfare. Such an image was not rare in the city. As a columnist describes in the issue, regiments returned weekly from the Philippines, greeted by adoring crowds. The picture, celebrating the violent put-down of Philippine fighters struggling for independence, offers a stark contrast to Widener's popular souvenir postcards, demonstrating the photographer's own understanding of San Francisco as a critical military port and providing precedent for his photographs in the WASP's special issue. The 1903 WASP issue opens with a photograph of the cable ship, the Silverton, at rest in San Francisco Bay. Carrying 2,500 miles of cable, the Silverton would eventually travel to Hawaii, connecting Ocean Beach with Honolulu. The following spread brings us aboard the ship. While we see civilians exploring the vessel above deck, Widener also brings us into the ship's bowels, depicting a group of cable staff standing atop of massive coil of cable, soon to be submerged. If, as sociologist Susan Lee Starr writes, infrastructure is by definition invisible, part of the background of other kinds of work, here Widener makes visible the cable that would form a critical link in a global telecommunications network, and also pictures a public eager to inspect the infrastructure of empire firsthand. Widener's photographs of the special issue provide a chain of images that link the continental United States with its colonized shores. While the telegraph cable symbolizes military might, economic expansion, and instantaneous communication, the photograph, as the fastest mode of visual reproduction, creates a connective visual tissue between American viewer and the country's Pacific possessions. Yet Widener is also careful to emphasize the sense of touch in his pictures, inviting the viewer to feel as well as see the infrastructure that would soon be submerged underground and underwater. In the Silverton's hold, we see the ship's crew grasping the cable that will ultimately pay out into the ocean's depths. We then move to Ocean Beach, where workers dig a trench in which the cable's shore end would be buried. In one striking image, a crowd of civilians line up along the cable, attempting to haul it ashore in the midst of turbulent waters. While the cable is visible in the foreground, it soon recedes from view, though following its curved line, we can see the Silverton waiting in the distance. These are pictures in which infrastructure is made tangible, in which civilians could see, feel, and imagine themselves connected to an archipelagic network. The text accompanying Widener's images explains that the feat of laying the Pacific cable not only involved traversing a great distance, but also overcoming the challenge of the seabed. From San Francisco to Honolulu, the ocean floor fluctuated in ridges and valleys the cable layers had to take into account. The commercial cable company received sounding data from the US Navy, which allowed it to undertake the project. Highlighting the precipitous rise and falls of the seabed, the WASP reminds us that networks are not linear. While the spaces they cross are often thought of as deterritorialized, frictionless surfaces, revisiting this early history underscores that this endeavor took place in complex and often turbulent ecologies. Indeed, splicing the cable on the shores of Ocean Beach proved no easy task. While the original date for connecting the cable to the shore wire was set for December 12th, rough waters made this impossible. On December 14th, the cable was landed, quoting here, hauled ashore by a vigorous crowd of men and boys amid deafening cheers. And as the Silverton steamed toward Honolulu, it encountered a severe storm, which almost snapped the cable. Ocean Beach thus emerged as a space where San Franciscans could imagine the nation's globalizing infrastructure. An estimated 50,000 people packed the beach to see the cable landed. As the WASP describes, such a crowd had never been seen in the vicinity. Men, women, and children, young and old, even mothers with babes in their arms, were present to witness the ceremony and greet the stout cord which was to bind the community to the nations of the distant Orient. In a single spread, Widener's photographs bridge the distance between the telegraph house on Ocean Beach and the shoals of Honolulu, where indigenous workers helped to drag the cable ashore. Whereas the text within the WASP contains no mention of the labor required to splice the cable at Honolulu, Widener's images make clear that indigenous labor was central to connecting the Trans-Pacific Line, completing the telegraphic circuit of the globe. Widener's journey forces us to reconsider his placid images of Ocean Beach and his stereotypical photographs of Chinese migrants, published in souvenir photographic postcards and transformed into ornamental objects. Just as Widener was publicizing his views of San Francisco leisure, he was following the movements of soldiers and cable workers as they violently redrew the boundaries of the United States. Returning to the photo cloth, we can now understand it not only as a decorative object that domesticates and contains the Chinese subject, reinforcing the racial politics within the continental United States, but also as an object that belies an expansionist impulse, an urge to imagine the domestic US as a growing empire. Widener's photographs provide a visual thread linking representations of San Francisco's Chinatown to a visual and material archive of imperialism. They help us understand that latent within racialized images of Chinatown was an awareness of the intimacies between the continental US and its new colonies, intimacies that would become submerged within mainstream US history. Visualizing this infrastructure is a method of grasping what often invades representation, but that fortifies the workings of empire. Thank you very much.